Then we will.
This meeting is being recorded.
That's a new one. I've just
heard. I haven't heard that before.
Yeah, that's a new one. I have the pleasure, which it really is a pleasure every time I get to see her or work with her, to introduce Dr. Ida Jones today. Those of you, excuse me, who were in the class last year may remember Dr. Jones telling us about Victorine Adams, who she wrote a book about. And this year, we have asked her to speak about someone who she has researched and she's known through history quite well, I think. Her name is Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, and the title I'm intrigued by. I'm very interested how she is going to, the title is Discarded Legacy Being Redeemed. So we're going to find out how Frances Ellen Watkins Harper's legacy was lost and is now being redeemed. And again, I sent you Dr. Jones' bio, but she is the archivist at Morgan, and she also is an author. We know about the Victorine Adams book and several others she's written, and a historian who is looks into quite a few different things. I think she's obviously interested in women, and especially Black women in history, but also I think in the church. Isn't that correct, Ida? Is that what you did your doctoral work on?
Yes, yes. Mm-hmm.
Yes. So I'm turning it over to Ida now, Ida Jones.
Well, thank you so much, Pam, for that. I do appreciate that, Dr. Young, if we're going to put handles on things. And I thank the Renaissance Institute for having these stimulating conversations. As much as you learn, you know there's always more you could learn, so you never stop learning unless you stop breathing. So I applaud you all for making these inroads to learn other things and to enrich yourself, I guess, when Jeopardy comes on, to be able to answer questions more aptly than we would have in the past. So I'm kind of excited about that. So yes, I am not an expert on Frances Harper, but she is very dear to me. And since we're in Maryland and I am now a neo-native resident of Baltimore City, I thought it's good to look at. I know.
I'm cheering.
Drag me up to Baltimore from the bowels of Washington, D.C., your southern neighbor, to talk about her. So the topic is Discarded Legacy Redeemed, Frances E.W. Harper, and she's a native Baltimorean. So ideally, we're going to look at Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, who was a freeborn African-American Baltimorean in September 24th, 1825, and she passes away on February 22nd, 1911 in Pennsylvania. She moves in with her aunt Henrietta Watkins and uncle William Watkins. Then we're going to talk about the Black church and anti-colonization, and then anti-slavery and abolitionist inclinations from her prose as a writer and her protest. And then ultimately the discarded legacy redeemed in terms of how she's been recovered from the ash heap of history, we'll say. So Frances, or the sable daughter of Baltimore, Frances Ellen Watkins was born in Baltimore City to freeborn African Americans whose names are lost to history because they were not recorded. The only child of her parents, she was orphaned by the death of her mother at the age of 3. And that's when she was sent to live with her maternal, it's actually aunt, and I have that incorrect, so I was doing some work. It's her maternal aunt, which is Henrietta, and her husband, Reverend William Watkins. This is one of the earliest pictures of her that we've seen online. She's wearing an appropriate bonnet and kind of living a middle-class life in Baltimore City with her uncle and aunt. So 1820s to 1830s Baltimore, from an African-American perspective, was much different than European immigrants that were coming here from various parts of Central and Eastern and Western Europe, as well as the indigenous population that was living here in various pockets or migrating, such as the Lumbee Indians and others in the state of Maryland. So in 1826, there were nearly 30,000 African Americans living in Baltimore City. And Baltimore City was much smaller than it is right now. Initially, the original square mileage was 10 miles that grew into 15 or 20 over the course of 100 years to the 90 plus miles we have now. So Baltimore was a very small city. It was a port town. So it was a very intimate space. So it's important to kind of see it in that early 19th century. The majority of the African Americans were listed as free people of color, while 10,000 African Americans were deemed enslaved chattel. So you have the situation of the modern economy of chattel slavery, which pretty much held its weight from the 17 somethings up until the 1880s in terms of trading in people as products or property. The Christian church provided a refuge for Black congregants, both Catholic and Protestant. Sharp Street, which is Methodist Episcopal at that time, which is now UMC, and Bethel AME were among the first two African American churches. So for African Americans who were freeborn, either self-emancipated through the purchase of themselves, through hiring out their labor to acquire money to purchase themselves, or were simply Africans who came from various parts of the world. Freeborn, a colleague of mine, her third great-grandfather came from Madagascar and settled in Western Maryland. And it's very fascinating that someone would pay for themselves to travel from Madagascar all the way to Western Maryland. And she has that rich family history there as well. So for African Americans who were born probably in the Western Hemisphere or in Maryland proper, they would affiliate with the Catholic Church and or the Protestant Church, Methodist in particular, here in Baltimore City. So Uncle William Watkins was an AME minister and a founding trustee of Sharp Street Church. Now, the interesting thing about AME and UMC, or United Methodist Church, is that there were African Americans in the Methodist Church as John and Charles Wesley created it. There was a schism in the 1790s up until the 1820s between African American and white parishioners at Methodist churches. In Philadelphia, Richard Allen and others were attending St. George's Methodist Church, and they were at the prayer rail in the 1790s, and they were seeking to finish their prayer when they were dragged from their knees or on their knees and thrown out of the church because it was not, quote, colored prayer time. At that time, Richard Allen set out to start his own, quote, fellowship and said he would never darken the doors of a Methodist church again, although he liked the Methodist Episcopal Church structure. So he creates in the 18 teens the African Methodist Episcopal denomination. At the same time in New York, there's going to be the African Methodist Zion Episcopal, AMEZ, and they're going to form along similar lines of racial discrimination, and they're going to add Zion to their name to kind of distinguish themselves from, quote, Allen's party. So you have in New York and in Pennsylvania these two denominations that were created by African Americans to express themselves in their faith fully outside of the racial stigma that was imposed by the church. There would eventually become a war in the 1860s around the same time, actually in 1840s to 1860s in the church, and there would be a split between the Methodist Episcopal North and the Methodist Episcopal South. And that's going to be over the issue, once again, of enslavement. There was a bishop in Georgia who inherited, quote, human property, and because the church discipline said he had to set an emancipation date for his property, which he did not do, he was stripped of his episcopacy, and that led to, quote, a civil war in the Methodist Church in the 1840s, and they split along geographical and ideological lines. Interestingly enough, there's actually a Methodist church in Washington, D.C., by the new convention center, and you can see it, it says ME South on the building since the 1850s. So it lets you know as far north as here, the idea of the South Church or the idea of the South Mind was very prevalent. So the ME Church North, ME Church South would not come back together again until 1958. And there has been since 1958 an effort to bring back all of the strands of Methodism, including the African strands, which has not happened yet. But it's my understanding that the strands of African Methodism have come together amongst themselves to pull themselves together and do that, and they have not been able to move forward with that because there was some issue with congregations having issue collapsing into one large Black Methodist body. That's the side note. So we'll come back to the 1800s. So William Watkins was born in 1803. He was very close to the Methodist movement. Daniel Coker, who was another African-American pioneer in the Methodist Church. And in 1828, he merged Coker's school with the Methodist effort, creating Watkins Academy for Negro Youth. Now, Daniel Coker was one of the individuals who believed in the colonization of African Americans to leave America and go back to Africa. So there were efforts by the English government as well as the American government to create spaces on the continent for, quote, their formerly enslaved persons or freeborn African Americans. Liberia was the area that African Americans would go to. Monrovia, as in James Monroe, the then president, was the capital of that country, and Sierra Leone was created by the British for their colonies to also repatriate back to Africa. This caused great schism, and ideally, William Watkins was an anti-colonist, and we'll get to that in a minute. But nevertheless, his Watkins Academy for Negro Youth used a classical curriculum that was infused with social justice for Black Methodists. This ignites young Francis. So once again, he's not railing against the system in an overt fashion. He's calling into question the idea of American Christianity that experienced freedom as the Pilgrims, experienced freedom as the ex-Catholic patriots that came this way, and experienced freedom at the Bastille in France. How does African-American communities be denied that same level of human freedom as Christ mandates in the Word? So Uncle William Watkins was an opponent of the colonization of African Americans to Africa. This position put him at odds with his friends and others who opted to migrate back. Watkins penned a letter in Freedom's Journal on July 6, 1827, regarding his thoughts on colonization. And you can find that speech if you Google it and read it in its entirety. It's very indicting. So it says, anti-Christian doctrine that justice cannot be done to us while we remain in this land of civilization and gospel light. They tell us we can never enjoy the unalienable rights of man in this, quote, land of the free and home of the brave. That if we desire the privileges of free men, we must seek them elsewhere, not in Haiti on account of its proximity to this country, but on the burning sands of Africa. And he goes on to discuss Africa in what we would call a relatively derogatory fashion, but nevertheless, as his understanding as an American born here in 1803. So a little further down in this paragraph where I say, or rather, is it not to get effectually and forever rid of that heterogeneousness or supposed dangerous element in the general mass of free Blacks, who it is said are, quote, a great nuisance than even slaves themselves. We are, say they, an inferior race repugnant to the Republican feelings, in short, a nuisance. So he's going to dig his heels in very clearly, and young Frances is hearing all of this. She's living in Baltimore, which had the largest free antebellum population of African Americans in the country, to be able to see enslavement and freedom beside each other, these dueling concepts of African American citizenry or citizenship in a country that declares itself a democratic haven, in a city that declares itself a religious haven for certain people, but yet denies it to African Americans. The young Frances is going to grow to adulthood within the contradictions of liberty and bondage. The free colored population in Baltimore grew throughout the 1830s and 1840s, accounting for nearly 1/3 of all African Americans in the state of Maryland. Hired out or newly emancipated African Americans flooded Baltimore for work and community to establish themselves. Frederick Douglass himself, a self-emancipated African American enslaved person, remarks on the conditions of the, quote, urban enslavement to plantation enslavement. He said there was a betterment in the city than in rural areas. Nevertheless, the brutality of enslavement impelled young Frances to action through poetry and prose. So she's raised in a Christian household. The whole idea of oratory is very 19th century. Her first book of poems, thought lost, but was found in the Maryland Heritage and Cultural Center, formerly the Maryland Historical Society. This was her first book published in the 1840s, entitled Forest Leaves. And it's done with a lot of Christian imagery and iconography, as most 19th century poems and writers were very wedded to the idea of the Protestant work ethic and Christianity. I was able to actually have them take this out of the vault so I could actually touch this book as a friend of Frances Harper, but it is available digitally. It is the only existing copy known to be in the world of her book of poems, which we would call a pamphlet. It's about less than 1/4 of an inch thick. It's not very thick, and it's not a hardbound book, but that was her first publication in the 1840s, thought lost, but found at the Maryland Heritage Center for History and Culture. So Frances eventually does leave Baltimore, and she joins the Maine Anti-Slavery Society, and she shares the horrors of enslavement she witnessed during her life in Baltimore. Her gifted writing and passion for justice delivered visceral denunciations of chattel enslavement. So here is a woodcut of a street scene in Baltimore. She would actually talk about it in one of her poems we're going to look at, seeing Africans chained from the dock. Now this is before she's born in 1825, so the international slave trade ends in 1808. However, people would send their, quote, chattel to the city to board boats to go to the deep south, and at times import persons from the north. So she's seeing enslaved Africans in various states of enslavement. Her most remarkable poem is this one here, Bury Me in a Free Land. It has been reprinted a number of times. It was officially published in 1864, and it starts in the upper left-hand corner, make me a grave wherever you will, in a lowly plain or a lofty hill. Make it among earth's humblest graves, but bury me not in a land of slaves. I could not rest if around my grave I heard the steps of a trembling slave. His shadow rise above my tomb would make it a place of fearful gloom. I could not rest if I heard the tread of a coffle gang to the shambles led, and the mother's shriek of wild despair rise like a curse on the trembling air. I could not sleep if I saw the lash drinking her blood at each fearful gash, as I saw her babes torn from her breast like trembling doves from a parent's nest. I'd shudder and start if I heard the bay of bloodhounds seizing their human prey, and I heard the captive plead in vain as they bound afresh his galling chain. If I saw young girls from their mother's arms bartered and sold for their youthful charms, my eye would flash with mournful flame, my death-pale cheek grow red with shame. I would sleep, dear friends, where bloated might can rob no man of his dearest right. My rest shall be calm in any grave, where none can call his brother a slave. I ask no monument proud and high to arrest the gaze of passers-by. All that my yearning spirit craves is bury me not in a land of slaves. This poem propels her to the front of the abolitionist movement in terms of her visceral account of something she experienced by viewing in Baltimore City, or possibly in Pennsylvania, where she eventually goes and lives in Philadelphia for a number of years, as well as various parts of New England where she also visited. So she also, during the course of her life, experienced racialized gendered violence, not at the hands of brutality, but witnessing other women, free women of color, talk about their assaults and the threatening ways in which they were disregarded in society. Even though they were women, even though they were freeborn women, they still had, quote, the taint of Blackness, and as a result of that, were treated as such. So after the uprising of Nat Turner in the 1830s, all African Americans were increasingly suspect of being seditious and wanting to be abolitionists. To temper any political or potential collaboration or uprising, freeborn and enslaved were subject to being kidnapped and sold for profit or convenience. African American women were subject to brutality, including sexual and physical assault. There was a number of police records we have at the Baltimore City Archive. Always have to talk about the archive. And the Maryland State Historical Society's journal talking about the rapes of young Black women in the 1800s down by the wharf with drunken sailors, as well as individuals who were perfectly sober, to exercise some level of violence and kind of put people in their place when they felt someone was too haughty. So Frances was fully aware of the societal limitations on her physical safety, and she used her prose to highlight the injustice along racialized gendered lines. So it wasn't just a matter of her being Black, but also the double exploitation of being female, that she's at the nexus of those two, quote, weak groups in the time period in which she's living. In 1891, her response to a speech called Duty to Dependent Races, she stated, in America, we have an emasculated Christianity, a Protestantism shorn of its protesting strength, where race scapegoating wrapped in bloodlust is brushed aside, trumping orthodoxy of Christianity. All that being said, that those persons who were assailants of African Americans were thought to be pranksters or just one-off. There was not a systematic pattern to attack and hurt and harm Black people, but they were always dismissed as being different than the body politic. So she is really indicting this conversation of this particular speech to say, if this is a Christian nation, then there needs to be a Christian response, and stop kind of emasculating or scapegoating race of those brutal individuals who are allowed to go unpunished and thus off the leash and out of the barn on every time. At some point, the victim cannot always be the victim when the victimizer is allowed to run roughshod over everybody. So her forthrightness continued to indict the country and other beneficiaries of the racial caste system in all social justice movements. And this is the beginning of the death knell for her in terms of the friction with the suffrage movement, because she was part of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. She's going to be an abolitionist. She's going to be a suffragist, but she's going to be an outspoken African-American woman who we would call a race woman nearly 100 years later in the 1920s and 30s, who loved African-American people on par with all humanity. She didn't exalt African-Americans above anybody, nor did she demean them. She simply wanted to be on par with other racial groups in the country. And the treatment that African-Americans received, in particular Black women, that substandard treatment she spoke out about, because it can't be fair if everyone is not being treated equitably. So this whole idea, we now call it being inclusive, or we call it intersectionality. Those are other terms we now use, modern terms. She was saying this, 100 plus years ago, 125 years ago. So in May of 1866, she delivers a speech entitled, "We Are All Bound Up Together." And this is before the National Women's Rights Convention. Her speech addressed the implicit racial biases within the women's movement prior to the passage of the 15th Amendment, and confirmed her observations. So prior to the passage of the 15th Amendment, there was the 13th, which abolished slavery. There was the 14th Amendment, which basically gives equal protection to all persons under the law. The 15th Amendment was the franchise. The franchise was going to be open to all non-property owning people. So white men who owned property were the principal benefactors of voting. When the 15th Amendment comes up for conversation in the 1870s, after the Civil War, there is conversation, do we enfranchise the other 90% of society? Or do we select whom of the 90 we give it to? So there was discussion, and they ultimately said we're going to enfranchise other men. So people call it the Black male franchise. It really gave all men who had no franchise or vote the right to vote. So propertyless or poor whites, Asians, Latinos, and others who were outside of the governing body politic were now given the franchise or the right to vote in 1870. This fracture split the Women's Party in half for the most part. And prior to this, Frances Harper is going to speak, and she's going to say, "I say then that justice is not fulfilled so long as women is unequal before the law. We are also bound up together in one great bundle of humanity, and society cannot trample on the weakest and feeblest of its members without receiving the curse on its own soul. I do not believe that giving the woman the ballot is immediately going to cure all of the ills of life. I do not believe that white women are dewdrops just exhaled from the sky. I think that like the men, they may be divided into three classes: the good, the bad, and the indifferent. The good would vote according to their convictions and principles, the bad as dictated by prejudice or malice, and the indifferent will vote on the strongest side of the question, the winning party. Talk of giving the women the ballot box, go on. It is a normal school, and the white women in this country need it. While there exists this brutal element in society which tramples upon the feeble and treads down the weak, I tell you that if there is any class of people who need to be lifted out of their eerie nothing and selfishness, it is the white women of America. So this is an excerpt of the speech. Here is a rather aged Frances Harper on the left, who was expunged from the narrative on suffrage. There's a 9-volume series that was done of the suffrage movement at the turn of the 20th century. And Harriet Tubman was inserted and replaced as, quote, face of Black female suffrage instead of Frances Harper. Now, it's very interesting because the women's suffrage movement was not a unified white banner either. There were issues of ethnicity as well as region and class and religion that also plagued the women's movement. So as much as we like to glorify the past and say that there was this great universal sisterhood, there was great fracture along real lines for people in terms of who you say you were versus who you actually are biologically born as. So we really need to kind of interrogate the women's movement for the kind of removing or the expungement of a Frances Harper, who was very clear and lived her truth, whereas a Harriet Tubman, who was enslaved, who was born in 1822 in the rural area of Dorchester County out in the Eastern Shore, is going to have a different trajectory than urban-born, free-born Frances Harper. So that's the beginning of her removal or her, quote, discarded legacy. This book here was published in 1994 by Melba Joyce Boyd, and it's where I got the title for this presentation. And it talks about the politics and the poetics of Frances Harper. So we know that in most revolutionary moments, the artists set the tone, whether it be theater, music, poetry, visual arts, dancing. The artists set the tone because they have a sense of feeling and they have a sense of beauty and justice in their productions or their products. So Melba says in her book, the independent spirit of writing is a testament to an attitude that presupposes possibilities for an alternative and radical reading of freedom. But when a people's history is whitewashed and blackmailed, and that's not misspelled, that was done intentionally, in order to reinforce the illusions of those defining the past, any discarded legacy is more readily restored via the spirit than by the alleged assumptions that have estranged it. So basically, she's saying that we have Harper's voice in her poems, we have her voice in her novels and her books and the other prose she's written. We have not found diaries of her. We have not found any kind of cache of letters from her, but she did leave her voice behind for us to follow. And she lived her truth for her 80+ years of living. So here are the sources that I use, and I gladly will take questions and have conversation with you. But I think it's very important for us to understand the importance of Baltimore City and Maryland in particular being the bellwether between, quote, the liberal North and, quote, the red or the conservative South. Maryland itself did not declare a side during the Civil War. It chose to be neutral, but in fact, there were pockets of strong leanings of Confederacy, as well as pockets of some liberalism and Union. So I think for Frances Harper to be born in a city at the time in which she was born, free, to be able to obtain an education, to be able to read the signs of the time, and to live as contemporaries of Douglass and Tubman and others really help you understand the temperament of a freeborn woman of little to some means, because she eventually does get married in the 1870s, and her husband does pass away by the 1890s. She eventually loses her only daughter by 1912. And so the idea of being orphaned is also a theme throughout her writing, of the idea of being abandoned because of having lost her parents, and then her husband, then her child, and this idea of where does belonging fit. So I want to thank you for your time, and I look forward to a conversation about her. I know it's a little brief, but I look forward to any thoughts or conversation you might have about Frances Ellen Watkins Harper and how this conversation is part of the redemption of her legacy.
Thank you, Ida. That was wonderful. I think it went by quickly. I'm still trying to place it all to come up with some questions.
Process it.
But let's ask the group if they have any immediate questions off the top of your head, or if you need to think about this for a while.
Yeah. I'm trying to process it too. Are there books that she has written? Do you have a, besides that one that you mentioned, are there other poems that one can read or other writings?
Ida, you're on mute. Ida, you're on mute.
Can't hear
Thank
you.
you for that. I was just mumbling to myself. Yes. So there are other books she's written. She wrote some novels about the enslavement era. One of them is very prominent, called Iola Leroy, or Shadows Uplifted. And I will include that in the chat here. And another one is called Men's Sacrifice. Iola Leroy. And that was a novel she wrote about enslavement. And then there's also another one she wrote called Men's Sacrifice. And I will also include that in the chat as well. And these are more novels than they are poems, because she does have a number of poems that she does have that she's written.
And are these available?
Yes, they are. They've been reprinted a number of times. You should be able to get them at the Enoch Pratt Library.
Oh, good.
Yeah, they've been reprinted a number of times. And some of them are actually available digitally too, but I like a hard book in my hand, so I don't know your opinions on that. I like to have a physical book in my hand, so yeah.
Interesting. Okay. But you don't know anything about any other poetry?
No, I know she's been in a number of edited volumes, and I don't know all of her books of poetry.
Oh,
but I know she's been anthologized in a number of places.
Was it Minnie's Sacrifice? Oh,
yeah.
I thought I heard you say men's. Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Ida, can you say more about her as an orator? I had the impression that she was very active on the oratory circuit, I guess they called it in those days. We certainly know that about Douglass, but I guess we are all bound up together that first gave me that idea that she made such a stunning speech at that women's, was that in Seneca Falls or was that after that?
No, that's way after that. And actually there were no black women.
That was 1860. Okay.
Yeah, there were no black women at Seneca Falls. The only African-American was Frederick Douglass actually there.
Yeah, I knew he was there. Yeah.
So like Sojourner Truth and others, they would actually obtain money for their speeches. Right. And so people would love to hear that. They'd raise money to either purchase individuals and or produce more literature. So she was very clear. She belonged to a number of organizations. So there is the Black Church she's working with. There's the Women's Christian Temperance Union she's working with to kind of get rid of the drink and stop the idea of brutality with alcoholism in various urban spaces. She's also going to be very much involved in the YM and YWCAs as well. So what we would now call social work. She's going to be doing that kind of proto-social work and helping connect people to resources that they need to do better. And she was very clear and very fiery in her speech. She did not have a soft touch. Sojourner Truth also had a bit of an edge as well, but Frances was very clear because she was a master of words to really pick the ideas of imagery, preferably biblical imagery, since that was what everyone could connect to. The idea of kind of this, Goliath and this kind of David going back and forth, or the injustices of the flaming swords of angels to come down and kind of trounce all the negativity. So she used lots of biblical allegory and imaging to talk about the injustice of slavery and that there would be a day of reckoning for those things. This is all pre-Civil War. So the Civil War, they all believe, was this kind of great moment of God to kind of purge the earth of this ugliness or this sin called chattel slavery and reborn a new America, birth a new America where everyone's free, which we know does not happen. So there is Reconstruction, there's a failure of Reconstruction. So she's going to continue her speech, even though she's kind of put out of the women's movement by the 1870s. And I meant to finish that off. So there are two women's parties. There's one with Lucretia Mott, and there's the other side with Susan B. Anthony. and they found their own different elements, they eventually reconvene and get the work done by 1920. But there's still some issue because all womanhood was not equal. And that's not just along racial lines, it's class lines, regional lines, religious lines. I mean, it's just so fractured. And so I think people like Harper, staying true to what she believed her life to be up until her passing in 1911, kept her line very clear. And as offensive as it might have been to some people, it was her truth and she was going to share that. Because she's not indicting any one person. She's really indicting a mindset. Because she's going to have white friends. She's going to have people outside of the African-American community who are loyal to her, who befriend her. So it's not as cold as a black-white dynamic. It's more a mindset of how should we be living as a Christian country and a self-professed Christian. How should we be living and modeling this, quote, faith to the world? Since America introduced herself as a Christian nation. And so as a result, there was such contradiction there that she sought to highlight those contradictions to bubble up and kind of purge the soil of that hypocritical behavior.
How was this treated by the church? Her works, how were they treated? Was there a reaction by the church at all?
There is some. I think Mr. Fast had his hand up. I wasn't sure.
Yeah.
Larry.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry, Larry.
Well, that's okay. I have an interest in Abby Kelly Foster, who was a very important abolitionist and suffragist. And in this biography of hers, there is a picture of Frances Ellen Watkins Harper up in this corner.
Yeah.
And it mentions that they worked together. And then I went through the index, and Frances Watkins spoke at the Massachusetts Abolitionist Society. I'm not sure the date, and it was very well. Her speech was very well received. It was mentioned. It was one of the more important speeches. And they also were on the same side on the controversy you were talking about. The opposite side from Susan B. Anthony and her group.
Thank you for that. So that ties into the question about the church. The church received this very well. The Black church received it, but there are always going to be these dueling mindsets. There are going to be those who prefer to go more relaxed and less aggressive, and those who are much more aggressive. And Frances was center-leaning aggressive in terms of her rhetoric. And then you're going to see the Presbyterians, the Methodists, I want to see the Catholics as well, all going to split in the 1840s over this issue of slavery. And at the dovetailing that issue of slavery is going to be women's rights. The women are going to have the 1848 Seneca Falls saying, well, wait a minute, if they want freedom, then we deserve freedom. So then this all needs to kind of, so the whole 19th century is percolating with all this kind of, the French have stormed the Bastille. You have now created this American democracy, and you have Jacksonian this, and where do we get our piece? Not the whole pie, they just want their piece of the pie. So I think the idea of even the abolitionists and the anti-slavery advocates, because the abolitionists were saying, let's go gradually. The anti-slavery advocates like, let's just stop it right now. Everyone just drop their chains, everyone just walk away free. So even though that's a rather extreme concept, because that's their money, how do you just tell me, get rid of my money? What do I have for money now? What do I have in terms of my wealth? If this property that happens to be flesh is my property, who's going to compensate me for that? So there's all of these smaller fractures that go on, but the Black church in particular, in some areas, and the AME church in denominationally was very clear that this is ungodly and God is going to punish this country for it. So when the Civil War happens, they're like, see, God's justice. And then you have the conservatives saying, okay, the lost cause, God failed us. So it's very the same exact issue being seen from different perspectives. And the lost cause to this day literally is still the driving force for some ideas of nationalism to certain elements of this country. And I've said, as much as I don't like to have to agree with it, that we have to acknowledge that element. They lost the culture as well. And so how do you resolve that? If I'm the nail and you're the hammer, we're not going to have the same perspective on what that looks like. But regardless, the hammer had a loss as well, and the nail had a loss. So now how do you do that? How do you adjudicate that? And so that's where we are right now in our culture. But a lot of this does tie back to that era where there are going to be voices like a Frances Harper, whether it be a Stacey Abrams or somebody else speaking in a certain tone and volume that offends people. But once again, if I'm the nail and you're the hammer, we're going to have a different relationship to wood.
Interesting.
And women can be, anyone can be the nail. Otherly abled, LGBT, women, poverty. I mean, it doesn't have to be a racial dynamic, although that's the principal filter I see through first. But the idea of this nail and hammer dynamic, in light of what just recently happened at the dinner down at Mar-a-Lago, really lets you know that there are two sides to this conversation. Now, sane and cooler heads would find a way to have a conversation. But some people just want to yell and scream. You can't reason with someone who's being unreasonable. So I think this is a very good example of what she's saying, Harper, in her rhetoric and in her prose, is someone has to maintain the line of civility and keep the bigger picture. It's not about me being comfortable, but how much more of us can be comfortable. If we all had clean water, if we all had, you know, safe streets, if we all had an education, how much better would we all live if the level of the water was higher versus it's high over here and there's drought over. At some point, we're going to connect ourselves to those quote people who have nothing, because they're going to come across to get what we have. So instead of being greedy, if we shared it, now it's called socialism, oh, this is socialism, then, you know, the idea is that everyone would have enough to live versus a piggish person having everything. And so this is human nature. Once again, we're dealing with the 21st century.
It's human
yes,
nature.
I see your hand, Ms. Dahawan. I hope it's
Yeah. Dr. Jones, thanks for your wonderful presentation. I had a question. You said she got to meet Susan B. Anthony. Did she ever get was in touch with Mary Garrett? Because, you know, these group of women were working together around many issues.
I believe so. They're contemporaries. And she lived through the 19th century as well. They might have been older than her, but I'm sure they would have met.
That was about 1875 or so. Because when Mary Garrett gave the money to Hopkins, she was around that time.
Yeah, she would have been in her 30s or 40s at that time.
Yeah.
About her 30s. Yeah, they would have all met. Whether they got along ideologically, possibly not, because there was the Jim Crow idea that we will collaborate, but put you in a different part of the line. But I do believe in terms of being rational women, especially those who were educated, they could swallow enough of that to get together to discuss the bigger picture.
Because you gave a beautiful description of, you know, their work together. The second question I had, when she was replaced because she was very outspoken by the lady, how did she take it? How was there any?
She kept talking. She didn't let that stop her, because I believe the volume that was published, she might have been closer to her 80s when that was published. It's a 9-volume set on women's suffrage. And so she never read the entire 9 volumes to know that she was not included. But I believe the kind of other Black women like Mary Church Terrell and eventually Mary McLeod Bethune and others will kind of become the ambassadors to white women's organizations. So at some point, for those who can't do it, not a problem. We'll still have a voice that's over there sharing and gathering intel. So at some point, she was much older than Terrell and Bethune as well. So she was a senior woman to those women who were born in the 1870s and 1850s. So she would have swallowed herself and let them go forward. Thank you.
Thank you.
She died in 1911, is that right?
Yes, 1911. Before Harriet Tubman. She died 2 years before Harriet Tubman.
So she wouldn't have seen the ratification. Yeah.
And she did have, I think you said she had a daughter. She did have children?
She had one daughter, yes.
One daughter.
The daughter died.
Her husband had children, but yes, her daughter died in 1908. And that was very painful. I don't know if it was tuberculosis or something like, consumption, they might have called it. But the idea of losing her husband and losing her daughter was extremely devastating, because she was an only child.
So nobody carried on. She had no one in the family to carry on this.
And that's part of her also discarded legacy, because there's no one there to advocate. Like Douglass had 5 children. And even though he lost one, he still had his daughter Rosetta, who was going to champion that, and her children. So she's going to carry the culture. And One is even a junior. So I mean, the Douglas he had people. Frances did not have people like that in terms of it. And also, I think because she's a woman as well. Very few women survive unless there is a coterie of people around them to kind of celebrate that. Because when Susan B. Anthony dies, I don't think she even makes it to the 20th century. In terms of getting to be able to see the third generation of women suffragists fighting for that right. So at some point, they're passing this baton to the succeeding generation with the hopes that at least their spirit will be there if they physically can't.
Wow.
Yeah.
Have you shared any of this information at the college at Morgan?
Not really, but we do have a Harper building. There's a Harper building here on campus, which I think is very nice. And is actually one of the professors here. He's a 7th or 8th grandson of Samuel Green, who would have been a contemporary of Watkins, Reverend Watkins. So we have almost a scintilla of Harper-esque presence on campus with that incubating Methodist group that started Morgan as well as Sharp Street. So,
really?
So there's a little thread of her here. When I pass Harper Hall, I think of her. People don't even know what that. The students don't pay attention, so they're oblivious. So we're trying to have a passive education campaign about who the buildings were named for, and have video monitors kind of just showing 20 or 30-second clips so that hopefully something is registering in their mind. But I haven't had a chance to formally share. No, not at all.
Oh, okay. Well, this was
there is such an effort now to rename buildings that have been named after slaveholders and others. And so it would be really appropriate and exciting, I think, to raise up the names at Morgan of the people who should be honored, and you know, to educate the students about it, and especially women. How many buildings are named after women on the campus?
I believe there's 7 of the 29 buildings on campus, I believe, are named for women, which is remarkable.
Yeah.
Of course, Ida Cummings named one for her mother when she was on the board of trustees here. But it's a male dormitory now, which is interesting. So when they think of Cummings, they think of Harry Cummings. And they don't think of a woman. They think of, oh yeah, Senator Cummings, you know, the guy. Harry. Like, no. So it's a male dorm where it was named with a woman's name on the building. So
White House should be considered too, because that was built by the slaves.
And Abigail Adams rebuilt it, didn't she? After had it rebuilt after the War of 1812. Or not Abigail Adams.
I think it's interesting times to learn and reflect.
Very much so. Very much so. Because it's a lot as we go into the next century.
I know, is the Pratt, the Pratt Library Center, are they familiar with what you have just shared with us? Since they are, they do have some of the, at least 2 of the books you're mentioning, and I guess they probably have the poetry somewhere in their collection.
They should be. I know that my colleague Vivian Fisher over there in the African American section should know. I believe she's a native Marylander. If not, the Maryland Heritage and Cultural Center has a very strong hold on her, and they have a very rich understanding of her. I know when they found that particular publication, it was just, I mean, our archivist moment of great joy, like getting all the Powerball numbers and the Powerball or something. I mean, it was apoplectic. They were apoplectic, and they were actually, I mean, when I went there and I said I want to see it, they're like, well, we don't take it out of the vault. We'll let you take it out. I was able to touch the original publication, which was, to me, beyond exhilarating. I mean, Blue Origins and the Mars or whatever, that was their moment. This was my moment to touch that document, which was found in a plantation records collection, which is very interesting. That they found as a graduate student doing work came across. So, I mean, because everyone thought that book was lost. I mean, nobody has a copy in the world, anywhere.
Wow.
All we have is her talking about having written it, but we never saw the actual book.
Not at the Library of Congress either, huh?
Nope.
Wow.
And they just found it in the Maryland
Very interesting.
archives. They just found
graduate
it.
Student doing research in plantation records comes across this very slim pamphlet, and it's like, oh, this is, and I think she actually was working on Harper too. So that's how, and so, wow. Incredible.
I see Terry has her hand up.
Yes, thank you for this presentation. Really wonderful. And I had to get up for a minute, so I may have missed this, but the Maryland Center for History and Culture, have they done any programming around this material?
They have a website about it, and I can try and find that and share that with you, but there was great public fanfare about it because, like I said, people could not believe that this was found. So there's a lovely article they have online about it. And
well, I was thinking something more substantive.
They might have, when they did it, it's been years since they found it. What, over 10 years maybe? They probably did something when they found it 10 years ago, but not recently to my knowledge have they done anything. But I know they found 10 years ago, about 10 years ago.
And have you spoken, or anyone from Morgan spoken about some of these finds and interesting issues that you have raised today?
I'm sure, I believe so. I believe the young woman who did her work on finding it has been kind of the authority of that particular document. And so she's done a lot of talks about it. And like I said, this has been a while. And she's at UMass. She was at UMass Amherst. I think it's about 10 years ago. And it was kind of a slight splash. I mean, for the fact that it's been missing or, quote, thought lost, it didn't get as big of a splash as what you're saying, which you would think, wow, it'd be like, you know, the Rosetta Stone or the Dead Sea Scrolls or something. It didn't get to that level of popularity. And that's probably more of the reason why her legacy remained somewhat veiled, because it was, I mean, even Frances Forrester, who was one of the original biographers of Frances Harper, I don't think she even knew about it. Because I sent a note to her and she was like blown away. And even Melba Joyce Boyd, they didn't hear about it. I think the only reason I heard about it is because I was here in the area. But it was not as big of a splash as it should have been. This lost work we thought nobody had. So I have to question that. I don't remember it being a big splash, because there would have been a lot of tongues wagging in the English world.
I just think that there would be a lot of interest in it now.
Yeah, there probably is now. There probably is, and you all can help spark this genius. They're saying 2015 is when this article was done, so that's a while ago.
What about a partnership with the Maryland Women's Heritage Center and the History and Culture Center? I mean, you could lead that one.
Why not? Her birthday's coming up. She's going to have her bicentennial birthday in 3 years. 25,
yeah.
In 25.
We'll make a note of that.
That would be a very good something to do, and to talk to this woman, Johanna Ortner, who was doing her dissertation on it. Maybe we have a symposium about it, because I think the idea of archives, recovery, and voice is huge. And as far as I'm concerned, there's no stage big enough for Frances Harper to be on.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah, I would certainly think that since there's an actual artifact that can be put on view, surrounding by some programming, that this is something that they might actually be interested in.
I like how you're thinking. That's a very good idea. It's just there's so many different things I'm working on. Can't have another one on my list. Thank you, Pamela.
You have 3 years to get it ready. And look at who these people are that are going to help you. And we have already a model for bicentennials. We have Virginia Poe's bicentennial. Now we can have Frances Ellen Watkins Harper.
I like that idea.
Yeah,
I like
let's
that
go
idea.
for it. And Terry will help us, right, Terry?
Well, I happen to be on the museum committee of the Center for the Maryland Center for History and Culture.
Oh, so she had double reason for asking.
So if you do put something together, you know, I'm certainly happy to help promote it.
Oh, that's awesome. That's great.
Well, wait a minute.
I think the Pratt Library. I'd pull the library in as well.
You need,
Terry,
you need to introduce this idea to your committee. Is that the board?
It's not the board. It's the museum committee.
The museum
of the organization.
you get them riled up about this, you see, and then the Heritage Center comes together and says, well, we have a tradition, or we know how to make a partnership to celebrate a lost woman's discarded legacy, like Virginia Poe, we did with Poe House in 22, yeah. And now we've got 25 coming up. So, and hopefully with no COVID coming in between, we could really do it on the actual year rather than 3 years later, like we're still doing women's suffrage 3 years later.
Yeah, no, it's not necessarily a problem, but a fact that museums generally have things laid out for the next couple of years. Mm-hmm. So it's something that if you're interested, I mean, really interested, if you put together sort of some sort of proposal, and even if you wanted to state, you know, what different organizations might want to collaborate or whatever, and send it to the director of the museum, that then they could take it from there, and hopefully they would assign somebody to it if they want to go forward with it.
Well, I appreciate that. I don't mind doing a proposal. That's not a problem.
Yeah, and as I say, you know, it's going to probably be a period of time. So you have time to finish up all those other projects you're working on.
But then more will come. We have to get this in there.
Just clear your plate.
But you have all this wonderful research that you've done.
Yeah.
Gosh.
And Joanna Ortner has done also, right?
Yeah, she's the one who wrote the dissertation, so I would defer to her and the other biographers. I'm just an aficionado of Frances Harper. And,
I mean, the thing is that you want to keep it very Maryland, because that's their focus. And I say something where there are artifacts, that there are things that reflect the history of Maryland from a slightly different perspective.
Yeah. Well, definitely the fact that her uncle was a pastor. Sharpstreet is still with us as well as Bethel AME. So there are physical spaces. And I love those downtown streets like Pratt Street and Light Street and Gay. I know she must have walked on these streets. So that also could be something that we could do a walking tour of some sort. And get stuff as well. And her house was in Pennsylvania. They have the one in Philadelphia. They don't have the house here, but her Maryland, you know, it'd be very interesting to look at that.
Yeah, we could find out where her house was. We could put a marker up there if the city let us put it in the sidewalk, right?
Yeah, I'm not sure. It's going to be downtown by the water, I think.
That's right. It wouldn't be.
It may have been burned down in the fire too.
But we've found a way around that with the Women's Industrial Exchange being the place for the marker for the original Just Government League, which was across the street, but it got replaced by the Verizon building. So we know how to work around the fact that sometimes the building isn't there, but the work is still, you know, the memory should still be preserved.
Well, I'm happy that this reception is this positive. I thought people would have known about her already in terms of just the slavery poem that she's done, that she's very known for, but I appreciate the enthusiasm, and that her bicentennial birthday is coming up. So that'll be.
I wonder if there's anyone else in the group that has any questions. I don't see any other hands raised, but I just thought I'd ask, or anybody else want to ask any questions or make any comments? No. Well, Ida, this was great.
The slave poem, is it the slave mother?
No, it's Bury Me in a Free Land. And
the one that you just read, but I mean, is that the one you thought we would know?
No, Bury Me is the one I thought you would know. Slave Mother, I think, is like Langston Hughes. Everyone knows that one. But
well, I can send that out because it's in the book. It's in the book. So I can send that out to everybody. Yeah.
I knew you would have that. I have mine too. I did bring my copy as well. I'm going the wrong way, But this is probably one of the better books to read about her politics, because she's weaving her literature and her prose to the political climate, which I think is very relevant to understanding how she identifies.
Well, that's wonderful.
And that book again, Ida, tell us again that book that you think is the best one to.
Discarded Legacy by Melba Joyce Boyd.
Oh.
Yeah.
That's where she got the title.
Yeah.
All right.
All right.
Well,
we
will turn off the recording now, and